Hi all, welcome back to the John Deere B tractor restoration. And in that picture there you can see the first reduction gear for the gearbox, and it is attached to the high-low range gear shaft there, or what I call the input shaft to the gearbox. Now, in a video a while back when we took the tractor to bits, when we took this cover off that goes over here, we discovered that this gear was actually slack on its tapered splines on this shaft. It was not tight. And so at the time I didn't think much about it. We took the tractor to bits, but obviously the problem was going to come back again when I came to put it back together. And what I've decided is that what's happened is that the bearing, just come over here to the cover, the bearing that was in this hole here had collapsed. There's a new one, and the bearing had collapsed. And I think because that bearing had collapsed, and funnily enough one or two I've done in the past, those bearings do come out terribly worn. I have one here in a box here, and you can see that it's absolutely jiggered. That's the same bearing out of another cover I took to bits a while back. So they do collapse. I think in the manual it just suggests that you take that bearing cover off, this little bearing cover off for once in a while, and pack it with grease. But obviously it gets neglected. And so I think with that collapsing, it had, with that bearing collapsing, it had made all this these bits on here go slack. This spacer, that spacer that fits there, had gone slack. And it had caused the gear to come slack on its taper. But in doing so, the gear and the shaft are slightly worn. I'm extremely lucky, in fact, that they aren't junk, because when you push the gear on, it does tighten back up. But it obviously has got a bit of wear in here now, and so the gear goes further on to the shaft. So this original spacer, cannot do its job anymore, and therefore it can't nip the gear. It can't nip the gear onto its shaft. And so what I've had to do is make a new spacer up of a slightly thicker length, bigger length. So that when you put the gear on, and when you put the spacer on, and then put the cover on that's over there on the bench, put that cover on, and when you put the cover on, you put the bearing in, and the bearing nips onto this area here, and then there's a nut tightens it all together. So effectively draws the shaft through, because remember this shaft does actually can at the moment move in and out of the gearbox. Effectively will draw that shaft through. The bearing on the cover is obviously fixed in that hole, it can't move, and so it draws the shaft. When you tighten it up, it draws the shaft up too, nipping the bearing against the spacer, and therefore pushing the gear tight onto its taper in here. I can't take this off because I've actually been, to make sure I made this spacer correctly, I've actually had the cover on and I've had to do some measurements, etc. But I needed this gear tight on the shaft, so in fact that gear is now tight on that shaft. It's actually Loctited on, and so I can't take it off to show the taper, but it is a tapered spline in here. I thought there was something possibly worn because these tapers here, these splines are virtually both they're near enough on the shaft sticking out this side of the gear, and when you put the original spacer on, it actually is rocking. I don't know if that's going to come up, but it actually rocks because it's interfering with the machining work of the shaft, which it shouldn't do. The new one, the new spacer I've made, I've actually made a relief in it. I don't know if that comes out, but I made a relief, so when you put it on, it actually is a much better fit. So yeah, that's basically what's happened, I reckon. I think with that bearing, this outer bearing virtually collapsing, and I vaguely remember I think it had been collapsed a long time. Obviously the gear and that have eventually come slack, and was causing a little bit of wear on the splines, and to get it all back right again I've had to make the new spacer up there, and once it's all nipped together it all nips up, and that determines, once it's nipped up in that outer bearing, that determines where the actual position of that shaft and gear will sit, and also determines inside here where the two gears for the high and low sit in relation to each other. And beforehand they were at their extremes of actually being in contact. Now they are they're all right. So yeah, that's basically what it is there. So I'm going to put the cover on. I'm not going to video it because although it's fairly straightforward, it's just a matter of bolting it in and tightening it down. But I'm not going to put it on because I suspect it'll take longer than 15 or 18 minutes that I do for these videos now. So I'm not going to do that. It should be fairly straightforward. And the reason I'm putting the cover on is because I want to fill the crankcase with engine oil, and I want to turn the engine over manually a few times to circulate oil through the oil pump and all through the oil lines, so as to be able to check that everything is working as it should, lubricating as it should. And therefore I have to put that cover on, because obviously that cover has engine oil inside it. I mean, that's the mains, the right hand mains bearing. Here's the crankshaft, right hand mains bearing. There's obviously oil going to come out of that bearing, and so it fills the inside of the cover up, and then it all drains back into the crankcase through that little drain hole there. I managed to find a core plug for that hole that I discussed earlier in a video a while back. It's actually out of an A4 Audi car gearbox. It's nice, it's a good fit in there. Of our belt and braces, I did put some silicone around it just to ensure that it doesn't go anywhere. So that should be good. So there's a tip for you if you're stuck. A4 Audi gearbox, they use a core plug like that. So that should be spot on. That'll keep the gearbox oil inside the gearbox and the engine oil inside the engine. So yeah, that's really about where we are with that. I've fitted the exhaust system roughly for now, making sure that it all fitted. I never noticed, but there was been a bolt snapped off here, so I had to drill that out to replace. I hadn't done it, it was obviously snapped before I got it. And in shot blasting I also noticed when I cleaned it all up that this bracket's been welded up, but it's been quite done well. It's been done well, so that's good. So yeah, so that's that on. I haven't painted it yet because unfortunately this tractor succumbed to somebody's hacksaw, and where the exhaust goes through the bonnet or the hood, they cut a square out so I could get to the bolts instead of taking the bonnet off, which is a real shame because it is in otherwise generally excellent condition, that that hood. So no, crying shame that. So yeah, I got my dynamo back eventually, all working. We discovered that in fact it actually had the wrong voltage regulator on it. It had a later one on, and it should actually only, for this model, it should actually only have the a cutout relay bolted to the top of it, which basically stop when the engine stops or the revs are so low that the dynamo isn't creating voltage. It stops the battery feeding back into the dynamo and potentially losing voltage through the dynamo. And the regulation on these tractors for voltage is actually that little what do I call it? The name will come to me in a minute. It's a little thing that sits on the light switch, and it stops it overcharging the battery, allegedly. Although I have read in one of the books saying where if your battery is boiling, then you need to turn the your dynamo, third brush down in the dynamo. But we'll come back to all that when we come to fix it. Resistor, that's it, the little resistor that sits in the back of the on the light switch. It's a little thing that just controls voltage, allegedly. So there we go. That's what we're up to at the moment. I hope that's explained what's gone on with that gear. But yeah, that bearing does generally get a bit of abuse. It's actually, to my mind, a bit light really, this bearing. It should be a bit heavier duty. Yeah, it would be a stronger bearing if it was heavier duty. But there you are, that's what it is. Okay then, very good. We'll bash on with that then. Thank you very much. Bye.